He was definitely a nice-looking, fine guy. His eyes was beautiful. His smile just lit up a room. My mom came running down the stairs and let me know that my brother had passed. So I was kind of in shock, not really registering it. It didn't make sense to me.
He was gasping for air. He was foaming at the mouth.
They were immediately struck by a very strong smell of bleach.
I've been on hundreds of crime scenes. We've seen it all. I'd never seen anything like this before.
Crimes like these are usually from somebody you know, somebody you're close with, somebody intimate.
There was a lot of talk in the neighborhood of this girl going around pretty much bragging.
She said what happened to him was payback.
She gets upset, something happens, and she uses violence.
She, in fact, was proud that she had won the fight.
It's a cool March night in 2017 when Chicago PD receives a call from the Inglewood neighborhood on the city's south side.
On March 6, 2017, at approximately 1:30 in the morning, there was a 911 call from a woman who was calling for help to the 6500 block of South Bishop Street.
She tells them that her friend Darius, who's 26 years old at the time, is at her door and he is foaming at the mouth and can barely breathe.
The victim made his way up to the second floor apartment.
He was in the hallway on the ground. They let him in and he crawled inside and lay on his back. The Chicago Fire Department was the first to arrive on scene. They found Darius Ellis stretched out on the ground, difficulty breathing. He was foaming from the mouth, his eyes were streaming, and his face was blue, like he was lacking oxygen.
The first responders notice a familiar but toxic odor.
There was an overpowering smell of bleach.
The Chicago Police Department ambulance immediately transported Darius to Stroger Hospital, which is one of our best level 1 trauma hospitals.
Darius Ellis was born in 1990 and raised in Inglewood. He grew up with his 10 siblings nearby.
We have a big family. We all grew up around each other. My father made it very clear that he wanted us to be close, so the age gap between me and Darius is only 3 years. My mom likes to call us two peas in a pod. We grew up about 4 blocks away from each other. For quite some time, his mom stayed literally maybe 4 to 5 blocks away from my mother, and we were there for 15 plus years. So we were very close, like, to each other. We would hang out every day. He would say I was his little big sister because of the way I treated him. He would literally be reluctant to tell me things if he did something wrong. That's how much I was more of the serious one, the one that really wanted him to, like, just be his best.
In the 90s, Inglewood was a close-knit community.
We could play all night with no issues, like, till the streetlights came on. We played basketball in the alleys with crates and played it and rode bikes and were able to just be kids at one point. And it seemed like at the drop of a dime, everything shifted and we had to worry about shootings and, a lot more violent things.
As Darius grew older, he took an interest in working out and weightlifting.
He's always been really active. He would lift weights. He didn't need to go to a gym. He could set up right at home, and he would just get busy. And then the next thing you know, we're getting a blast of pictures with his shirt off. So he had to show off those muscles, those pecs. He would be flexing. He was just proud of the progress he was making,
His physique, combined with his natural good looks, made Darius popular with the ladies.
The ladies loved him. He loved them back. He was fun, outgoing, easy.
And I definitely will say women seen how attractive he was. And when he met his baby mother, he actually told me about her after she got pregnant.
At 21 years old, Darius became a father.
Darius' life changed, I feel like, drastically when he had his son. I feel like when he had his child, it gave him purpose. That love, I feel like, is immediately when Darius had his kid, he made that decision to make sure that he would be in this kid life every day, show up every day, because it was important, because we knew how it was to not have that. That void in our heart, I feel like, pushed him to just be the best. He just wanted to be the best he could be for his kid. He was a welder. He was getting into the construction business. Him and another one of my brothers as well. They both were kind of like going tit for tat with that. That was their interest.
Darius worked on various construction projects throughout the city.
I remember him telling me about it and just being like, man, sis, I'm doing construction and it's going really well. I did this big project. Like, he was just happy about it, and I was proud of him, you know, just seeing him go for something that he loved doing.
He was well on his way to making himself known in that industry.
His relationship with his son's mother didn't last. In 2015, Darius met 22-year-old Yasmin Elder.
When they met, Yasmin wasn't really interested in Darius. She thought that he was a player. She thought that he had a lot of women. And so she didn't really want to invest her time there. But eventually, he was able to charm her, wear her down, and they entered into this relationship.
Yasmin was a bright spot, but 2017 brought big challenges as well.
He was a welder, but he was living in his van at the time, in between jobs, just down on his luck.
With welding and stuff, it's only certain projects you can get. So I feel like it kind of fell slow for a little bit for him. So he was struggling. Here's the thing though, Darius always have somewhere to go. He could come to my home, open arms, without a problem. And he knew that, he was aware. I just think he was just one of those strong-willed men that didn't want to budge on, asking anybody for too much help. He just didn't want to be a burden. He was a strong man. He wanted to be a man. He was dealing with things.
On March 6th, Darius is rushed to a local trauma center after showing up at a friend's apartment, foaming at the mouth and reeking of bleach. Doctors spend 2 hours trying to save him.
Unfortunately, it's too late. At 3:26 in the morning, Darius is pronounced dead at the hospital.
I was working as a detective assigned to Area 2, and our office received a phone call about a death investigation from 7th District personnel, and they stated they had a deceased victim at Stroger Hospital. I arrived in the early morning hours. It was probably around 4:00 a.m., and I went to the emergency room where I spoke to the doctor about the details of the deceased, and he stated that the victim had some type of caustic substance poured onto his face and his nose area. He said that the caustic substance that was in his nose and mouth would have burned his throat and caused it to swell, thereby causing him to suffocate.
In the morgue, detectives get confirmation as to what that substance was.
They opened up the body bag and were immediately struck by a very strong smell of bleach. Police detectives inspected Darius's clothing, and there was a very strong odor of bleach. They immediately inventoried that property.
I took the clothing out of the bag to examine it, and I came across a black hooded sweatshirt that had the distinct spill pattern around the neck area, and it was discolored orange from the black. And through my rubber gloves, I could feel that the clothing was completely soaked. Because of the large amount of bleach involved, this led me to believe that this was not self-inflicted, that we had a murder on our hands.
The detective was able to determine that this was foul play pretty much immediately.
This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. And who the hell would do this to someone? It just leaves you speechless.
In the early morning hours of March 6, 2017, 26-year-old Darius Ellis dies at a Chicago hospital after showing up at a friend's apartment in distress.
When the detective talked to the doctor said there was extensive damage done to the inside of his mouth and his throat from bleach, and the initial cause of death was asphyxiation.
The police were able to recognize that this was foul play.
I spoke to the patrol officers that were at the hospital. They gave me the particulars of the case, provided me with the name of the victim and the location of where they believe the crime may have occurred. So I finished my investigation at the hospital at that time and then relocated to the crime scene. I went up to the second floor apartment on Bishop and I spoke to a witness who turned out to be a friend of the victim, Darius Ellis.
In the apartment, we have 3 adults. We have Darius's friend, and we have the son of Darius's friend and his girlfriend.
These were the witnesses in the house who helped Darius when he knocked on the door asking for help.
Around 12:30 in the evening, Darius's lady friend heard a knock on her apartment door. And she proceeded to the door and heard Darius whisper in a raspy voice through the door, "It's me, Darius."
When she opens the door, she sees her friend Darius lying outside of her apartment on the ground, arms spread, legs spread, gasping for air.
She could hear his labored breathing. She could see that there was just a white foamy substance coming from his mouth. But what was so surprising and just astounding was that the aroma that was coming from him. And there was just that overwhelming stench of some type of cleaning chemical.
Darius tried to speak.
He told her that 2 men had held him down and poured bleach into his face.
He quickly became unable to talk, but his friend noticed he was still trying to communicate with her.
Darius couldn't talk because he was struggling to breathe, but he held up a cell phone and showed it to this woman. She did not know what he meant by this gesture, but she did know that this cell phone did not belong to Darius.
At that point, the friend became too concerned about Darius's health to try and understand what he was communicating.
She realizes very quickly that Darius is getting worse, so she has no choice but to call 911.
She points out that the flip phone was left behind when Darius was loaded into the ambulance.
The police are able to recover a few things. They get his cell phone, and they also get this flip phone, and they're able to also get his car keys.
Darius's friend says that his silver minivan is still parked in front of her building.
She informed the police of what he had been doing. Lately, he's trained as a welder, but he had been in between jobs and unfortunately living in his van.
I was able to obtain the keys to Darius's minivan, and upon opening it, I was instantly overwhelmed with a very strong odor of bleach. It was so strong that I was unable to investigate the interior of the vehicle without going back to my squad car and getting a mask.
Once inside the minivan, police noticed large amounts of liquid on the windshield, on the passenger seat, and on the floor. Immediately, the police called for an evidence technician to have him swab the liquid and take photographs.
I noticed a spill pattern on the front seats of the vehicle, which caused a discoloration to the darker interior, making it orange in appearance, which matched the same spill pattern I saw on Darius's hooded sweatshirt in the hospital. Upon examining inside the vehicle, there was numerous items strewn about, clothing, and a liquid substance was all over the windshield, the seats, the floorboards, the ceiling, which was indicative of a struggle in a close quarters area.
The detective is able to confirm that this is definitely the scene of the crime.
While it's clear a struggle took place in the van, investigators don't believe Darius's claim that he was attacked by two large men.
Seeing the interior of the minivan and how cluttered it was, there was no way two big guys were pinning him down inside a minivan. The statement he made to the witnesses and the patrolman's reports led me to believe that he was trying to cover for someone.
In March of 2017, Chicago detectives are in the Inglewood neighborhood investigating the bizarre death of 26-year-old Darius Ellis. After processing the van where they suspect Darius was forced to drink bleach, they scour the area for evidence.
We were looking for a carton or something, type of container that could hold the bleach, and we checked the garbage cans nearby, we checked the empty lot.
Before they leave, they ask Darius's friend who the single father spent time with.
She responded that Darius had a history of being a ladies' man, but that lately he had actually been dedicating all of his time and energy to one woman in particular, 24-year-old Yasmin.
Yasmin lived a few blocks away. She was a few years younger than he was. She was living with her relatives, an uncle, her grandparents.
Before they talk to Yasmin, investigators learn that the Cook County Medical Examiner has completed Darius's autopsy.
The doctors concluded that the pH level in Darius's stomach was at 12 to 13, which is more than double the amount of a normal human's pH level.
The chemical makeup or whatever of bleach would cause your throat and mouth to swell so quickly that instantly closes like a fist and you die from suffocating. He couldn't breathe. He died because he got asphyxiated. His findings were that Darius's death was caused by the forced administration of a caustic substance. It's officially ruled a homicide. I've been on hundreds of crime scenes before. Big city detective, we've seen it all. I'd never seen anything like this before. This was murder with bleach. Unusual.
As far as who could be responsible, Darius's family is at a loss.
Darius didn't have any enemies. He got along with his ex. He had a close relationship with his son.
To be honest with you, I don't even understand what motive anyone would have to want to poison someone and kill them.
Later that day, detectives ask the woman who called 911 to come to the station for a follow-up interview. She relays a troubling story.
The friend told police that on the night of the incident, when Darius was taken to the hospital, that she walked down to Darius's family's home so that she could relay to them what had happened. On her way to their home, she ran into Yasmin Elder.
She stopped and she informed Yasmin of what had happened to Darius, and Yasmin's response, she laughed. Darius's friend also said that then Yasmin said, as she was laughing, he shouldn't have put his hands on me.
Yasmin's reaction to what happened to Darius and the state that he was in, the laughter is, it's troublesome.
The police asked Darius' friend if she noticed that Yasmin had any injuries on her body. Darius's friend stated that nope, not to her. She didn't see that there were any injuries noted on Yasmin's body, but did say that Yasmin made mention that bleach had gotten into her eyes and that they were burning.
She doesn't know her last name, but tells police Yasmin lives in the neighborhood and has been in trouble with the law before.
The woman let police know that Yasmin wouldn't be hard to find. She has a distinguishable tattoo on her neck. She does have a past with law enforcement, so she's in the system.
I told my supervisor, I got a hot case going here, and it's domestic related, and we could probably solve it right now. I'm going to ask for help from the day's violent crimes guys. And they helped me out. I threw out that name Yasmin. 4-block area where she lives, and a tattoo on her neck. That's when Civisec put the parameters in, and within 1 minute, we came back with that picture.
Investigators find one woman who matches all those criteria. 24-year-old Yasmin Elder.
I was able to pull up Yasmin's arrest photo because just recently she was arrested for battery.
She had been accused of using a metal lock to hit her landlord in the head during a dispute. They find that she's currently on court supervision.
Yasmin now has an established history of being violent. It's sounding like that she gets upset, something happens, and she uses violence.
They take Yasmin's picture to Darius's friend.
Based on all of the information that the police had, they put together a photo lineup and they showed it to the woman, and the woman immediately pointed Yasmin out.
After the witnesses picked Yasmin out of a photo array, we now had probable cause to effect an arrest.
As Chicago police look into the gruesome death of 26-year-old Darius Ellis, they learn of incriminating statements made by his girlfriend, Yasmin Elder, in the hours after he died.
Yasmin laughed and said to the friend, "He shouldn't have put his hands on me."
Based on all of the information that detectives were finding out about Yasmin, her law enforcement past, the troubles that she's had, the court supervision, the battery charge, it was beginning to look more and more like maybe she did have something to do with this and we need to talk to her immediately.
As investigators prepare to bring Yasmin in, they know that connecting her to the crime could rest in a clue Darius offered just before he lost consciousness.
He couldn't speak, so what he did was he had a phone in his hand, he held it up, and they knew that the phone wasn't his.
He was holding a phone in his hand. When they asked, "Who did this to you? What happened?" all Darius could do was point to the phone in his hand.
The key to the whole case was Darius holding up that phone.
Armed with an arrest warrant, police head back to Inglewood to look for Yasmin.
So we quickly went to the last known address where we believed Yasmin was staying, which was her grandmother's house. Yasmin wasn't home at the time, but her grandmother did state she was staying there. After speaking with the grandmother, we were able to have her sign a consent to search form in order to search the area where Yasmin was staying, looking for evidence.
They're able to go into Yasmin's room and do a search, and what do they find? They find a pair of black pants that are covered in red stains that seem like bleach stains.
Speaking to the grandmother stated those were the clothes she wore the night before when she came home and changed. We seized the pair of pants and had them recovered by an evidence technician to test the liquid stain on the pants.
Yasmin's grandmother doesn't know where she is.
We told her we'd like to speak with Yasmin, and we left our business card with her, and then we left.
Word hits the street that the police are looking for Yasmin. But the rumors are already running wild.
There was a lot of things being said in that neighborhood. Like I said, everything was close. It was a lot of talk in the neighborhood of this girl going around pretty much bragging about it. I don't think any of us knew about Yasmin. I've never met her. So I didn't know, I had no recollection of this lady whatsoever. I didn't know who she was, to be honest. I didn't know anything of her into this situation. But we were looking for her, essentially. Like, we were trying to get her in custody. We were trying to figure out what this woman was.
Time was very important because we were afraid that she might try to flee the state or flee whatever because she has to know she's a wanted person.
It appears that Yasmin does know that she is being sought after by police.
Several hours later, we were contacted by Yasmin saying she was willing to speak with us.
After getting that call from Yasmin, police immediately went to her home and arrested her.
She was very cooperative, turned herself in. Yasmin was transported to detective headquarters where she was placed in an interview room and placed under video and audio surveillance. She was Mirandized, stated she understood her rights, and she was willing to speak with the detectives.
Detectives have a lot of questions for Yasmin.
In my entire career, there are very few incidences of people dying from ingestion of bleach.
It's just not understandable. Bleach. This is what killed this man. Bleach was poured down his throat. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. And who the hell would do this to someone?
After Darius Ellis dies from forcibly ingesting bleach, Chicago detectives question the main suspect, his girlfriend, Yasmin Elder.
So once the police arrest Yasmin, they ask her what was the relationship like between her and Darius.
They were on and off. They saw each other, but it wasn't serious. About a month before the incident, they decided to get serious, and they were in fact engaged to be married.
Yasmin told detectives that she and Darius had been dating on and off since 2015, but at the beginning of 2017, they finally decided to get engaged.
But instead of happiness, the decision brought instant drama.
Darius and Yasmin both were experiencing some insecurities around the relationship. Even though they were supposed to be committed, they both were in fear that there were other people involved on both of their sides. Yasmin believed that Darius was a ladies' man. Darius had caught Yasmin texting an ex-boyfriend and had some insecurities around that. Yasmin was also very upset that in 2 years she had never met his family and they were about to get married.
It just became a toxic relationship. He just became so much more enraged, so much more jealous. He would accuse her of cheating, and sometimes he got physically abusive, according to Yasmin.
Yasmin told police that the physical violence had increased over the last 2 weeks prior to the incident. That in fact, 5 days prior to the incident, while at a laundromat with Darius, that Darius caught her texting her ex-boyfriend on her cell phone. Darius became so enraged that he choked her.
When detectives asked Yasmin why she didn't report any of this domestic abuse before, she said that she was under supervision for a fight that she had unrelated to this incident and was afraid that police just wouldn't believe her.
She says that by the night of his death, tension between them was high.
Yasmin told police that on the night of the incident, Darius had picked her up around 12:30 a.m. on the morning of March 6th. During their ride home, Darius became enraged because she was in fact texting the ex-boyfriend again during the ride.
He pulled over, came out of the car, ripped her out of the car, and threw her to the ground. Yasmin says she got up again, but he grabbed her and threw her down a second time. Yasmin told detectives that she was screaming for help and that Darius picked her up and forced her back into the van.
And she tries to call 911, and he knocks the phone out of her hand.
Yasmin told detectives that during the fight, Darius bit her hand, grabbed both her arms, punched her in the thigh, and in the back of the head. Darius pulled over, and now it was a physical altercation. He was punching her, he tried getting on top of her, but Yasmin grabbed his hair and was pulling him and eventually got him on the ground between the seats.
Yasmin stated she was able to overpower Darius by pulling him to the ground by his hair and then pinning him there with her knee using her weight. She also made a statement that she said at this time, I was winning the fight.
Saying things like, I'm winning this fight, implies that in this moment, Yasmin felt vindicated in what she was doing. She felt like, maybe you've done this to me before, and this time, it's not gonna happen. I'm gonna win. I'm gonna stand up for myself.
When police asked Yasmin how she was able to overpower Darius, she told police that she weighs 207 pounds, and at the time of Darius's death, he weighed 130 pounds.
The fight continued into the back seat of the minivan, at which time Darius swung a plastic bottle at her that she said contained bleach, but she blocked it.
Yasmin wasn't sure if Darius was attempting to hit her with a bleach bottle or attempting to splash her with the bleach.
Yasmin feels like she has to fight. She's in survivor mode. So while Yasmin's knee is still on Darius's waist, she's able to gain control of the bleach and take it away from Darius. At this point, she starts to pour the bleach all into Darius's mouth.
Yasmin related she then jumped out of the minivan and heard him gasping and trying to breathe. And he called out to her, "I can't breathe, I need to go to the hospital."
She, despite hearing this, continues to walk away. And a moment later, she states that he got behind the wheel and drove off.
Yasmin related that she walked for a little while and then got onto a bus and went back to her neighborhood.
After all the questioning during the interrogation, it never came across to me that Yasmin was fearful for her life. It almost seemed like she was in control of this fight the entire time and could put an end to it anytime she wanted to. Not once during the interrogation did she ever say she was fighting in self-defense. She said, "He started hitting me, and I fought back, and I was winning."
She, in fact, was proud of the fact that she had won the fight.
In Chicago PD's Area South Detective Division, Yasmin Elder has just admitted that she was in a physical fight with her fiancé the night he died.
Yasmin stated as the fight went on that Darius grabbed a plastic bottle containing bleach and he went to hit her with it. She stated she was able to obtain this bottle somehow, at which time she used it to pour into his mouth.
Yasmin claims the fight came after suffering abuse at Darius's hands in the weeks and minutes before the fight.
Police asked Yasmin about any injuries that she might have received. She told police that she had gotten bleach in her eyes, that Darius had bit her on her hand, and that he had punched her in her thighs as well as had hit her in the back of the head.
After speaking with Yasmin and the statement she made about receiving injuries from Darius, we photographed various parts of her body, and none of the photographs revealed any type of injury. There was one bruise on her thigh, and we also noticed a red mark on her hand that we believed was a burn from a caustic substance.
There are no bite marks on her body. There are no obvious signs of a struggle. There's nothing around her eyes to substantiate these claims.
Nor is there any proof that Darius ever laid a hand on her.
We didn't see anything that would indicate that happened. And why hadn't she ever made a police report before? Why hadn't she told anyone else before?
But the most powerful moment in the interview with Yasmin comes when detectives present her with the flip phone Darius held up in his final dying moments.
When presented with the evidence of the flip phone, Yasmin agreed that it was indeed her phone. Darius, in essence, solved his own murder.
Investigators now believe that Darius's initial claim he was attacked by two men was an attempt to save Yasmin.
When he thinks he's going to survive, he wants help, but he's not going to tell him that it was his fiancée, Yasmin. So he says it was two black guys who held me down. He didn't think he was going to die. He just wanted help. He didn't want her locked up.
But then Darius realized his situation was more serious than he thought.
They didn't want to get her in trouble at first, but as he's dying and he realizes he's dying, he then tells the truth. The state's attorney's office interviewed witnesses and reviewed reports and all the evidence, and on May 7th, 2017, charged Yasmin Elder with one count of first-degree murder.
First-degree murder charges in Illinois carry a minimum of 20 years in prison up to 60 years in prison. First-degree murder requires intent.
Yasmin's bail is set at $1 million.
I do recall my brother letting me know. He did make us all aware that she was in custody.
Darius's family is stunned by the truth and by Yasmin's claims that she and Darius were engaged.
If they were planning to be married, one of us would have known. Darius is close to his siblings. Me, my brothers, we all spoke frequently on the phone. Whether we seen each other or not, we talked. We were very close. So if he was planning any type of engagement or proposing to someone, I definitely feel like we would have known. You say that you guys are engaged and you were shopping for a wedding dress and all of these great things. Why would you want to poison someone that you love?
On February 13th, 2020, Yasmin pleads guilty to second-degree murder.
The negotiation between her lawyer and the prosecutors in this case resulted in a plea agreement of 15 years, which was 5 years below the maximum sentence that could be had in second degree.
We held up our end of the bargain as the Chicago Police Department. We did a thorough investigation. We put the facts together, and we put a person in prison who committed the murder.
When Yasmin ran into Darius's friend, what she told the friend was that Darius should not have put his hands on me, that what happened to him was payback for what he had in fact done to her.
I think that her response of he shouldn't have put his hands on me was a person that is trying to justify something that they did. Like, no one has proof of Darius ever putting his hands. She didn't have any markings on her body. She didn't have any bruises, any of those things. This is a strong man. If he's putting his hands on you, you will have something to show for it. You had none of that. So at that point, I think that it was her way of just giving people a reason. Oh, this is why I did it. So it could be justified maybe as payback. This is why I did it. But I really feel like it's not payback from him abusing her. I think it's payback from him denying her and her being jealous of what he had going on.
Not once did I ever feel that she felt guilty about what happened.
But for the people who love Darius, the justice is short-lived.
Yasmin Elder received time credit for serving 31 months prior to her trial and was released on parole in May 2024.
She should have not only served 6.5 years. She killed my brother in cold blood.
In spite of Yasmin's release, the Ellis family continues to honor Darius's memory.
You lose a lot when you lose someone, and the Englewood community, Darius's family, they all lost a great human being.
He embodied love. So I just know he was.
The road outside Adelaide doesn't look like the kind of place where stories begin. Not the kind that stay with you, anyway. It's just asphalt stretching into the dark, flanked by low scrub that trembles whenever the wind brushes through. At night, the silence feels heavier than it should, as if it's holding something down. The kind of silence that makes you instinctively lower your voice, even when you're alone. On certain nights in the early 1980s, that silence was broken not by screams, not by anything so obvious, but by engines idling too long, by doors opening and closing somewhere out of sight, by footsteps that didn't belong to anyone who lived nearby. And sometimes, days later, something would be found. A body. Always young. Always male. Always in a place where no one expected to look until it was already too late. At first glance, there was always an explanation waiting. A rope and a tree suggested despair. A burned car whispered of accident or recklessness. A quiet roadside hinted at a solitary decision made in the dark. Each scene, taken on its own, could be filed away neatly, labeled, forgotten. But the details didn't behave. There were inconsistencies. Small ones, at first. A knot tied the wrong way. Burns that didn't match the story. Toxic substances where there shouldn't have been any. And beneath all of it, something harder to name, a feeling that these scenes had been arranged, not discovered. As if someone had taken the time to think about how death should look. And more importantly, how it should be believed. Long before the name the family murders entered public consciousness, the pattern was already forming in fragments. A death here, another there. No obvious connection, except for a quiet repetition of age, vulnerability, and circumstance. Teenage boys. Young men just stepping into adulthood. Lives that hadn't yet settled into shape. They disappeared in ordinary ways. A night out. A short trip. A moment of independence that should have been harmless. Then they were gone. And when they returned, if they returned at all, it was in silence, in stillness, in ways that didn't quite make sense. What made it worse was not just the deaths themselves, but the way they seemed to slip through the cracks of certainty. Families were left with questions that didn't have edges. Police reports that hinted at conclusions without fully embracing them. Conversations that stopped when they reached certain names, certain places, certain possibilities. There are cases where violence is loud, chaotic, undeniable. This wasn't one of them. This was careful, patient, almost methodical. Whoever, or whatever, was behind these deaths didn't rush. There was time taken, not just in the act itself, but in what came after. Scenes were shaped. Narratives were suggested. Evidence was not quite erased, but guided, like a hand gently steering attention in the wrong direction. And for a while, it worked. Because people want explanations that make sense. A troubled young man. A bad decision. A tragic accident. These are stories that fit comfortably into the world as we understand it. But there's a different kind of fear that begins to grow when those explanations start to unravel. When one case starts to echo another. When the same questions keep resurfacing, unanswered. Why here? Why them? And why does it feel like someone is watching from just outside the frame? In the years between 1979 and 1983, that feeling began to spread quietly across South Australia. Not as panic, not as headlines screaming for attention, but as something subtler. A discomfort. A hesitation. Parents started asking more questions when their sons went out at night. Friends noticed when someone didn't come home, and they didn't brush it off as easily. There were whispers, too. About groups. About men who knew each other, who moved in certain circles, who had influence that extended further than it should. Nothing concrete. Nothing that could be pointed to and held up as proof. Just enough to make people uneasy. Just enough to make silence feel deliberate. And then there were the stories that never made it into official reports. Stories told quietly, between people who trusted each other enough to speak, but not enough to go public. Stories of encounters that felt wrong. Of invitations that didn't sit right. Of situations that seemed to shift from normal to dangerous in ways that were hard to explain afterward. Most of those stories ended with the person walking away. But not all of them. Because somewhere in that stretch of years, between the familiar streets and the empty outskirts, between the visible world and the one that operated just beneath it, something was happening with a consistency that defied coincidence. It wasn't chaos. It was selection. And that's what makes this case different from so many others. Because randomness can be understood, even if it's frightening. But intention, especially hidden intention, suggests something far more unsettling. It suggests planning. It suggests collaboration. It suggests that the truth might not belong to one person, but to many. And that uncovering it would mean pulling at threads that lead into places no one was prepared to confront. The first time a detective looked at two of these cases side by side, there must have been a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when the possibility surfaced. What if this isn't isolated? What if these deaths are speaking to each other? It's a dangerous thought, because once it takes hold, it changes everything. It forces you to reconsider conclusions that once felt solid. It demands that you question not just the evidence, but the absence of it. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it raises the possibility that someone else already knows the full picture. Someone who has been there from the beginning. Watching. Participating. Ensuring that the story, as it reaches the outside world, remains incomplete. There's a particular kind of horror in cases like this, not in what is seen, but in what is implied. In the spaces between facts. In the gaps where answers should be, but aren't. Because those gaps can be filled with anything. Fear. Speculation. Truth. Or something deliberately constructed to look like truth. And as more bodies were found, as more families were left with the same hollow questions, those gaps only grew wider. The official narrative struggled to keep pace with the quiet accumulation of doubt. And somewhere, behind all of it, the sense persisted that this wasn't over. That it wasn't just about what had already happened, but about what could still happen next. Because patterns, once established, don't simply disappear. They either evolve, or they're interrupted. And in the early 1980s, in and around Adelaide, no one yet knew which of those outcomes they were heading toward. All they knew was that something was wrong. Deeply, persistently wrong. And whatever it was, it had already taken more than anyone realized. The road stays quiet now. The wind still moves through the scrub in the same way. If you stand there long enough, you might convince yourself that nothing ever happened at all. But that's the thing about places like this. They don't remember for you. They don't tell you what they've seen. They just hold it. And wait. In the late 1970s, Adelaide wore a calm face so convincingly that few people ever thought to question it. It was a city that moved at its own pace, unhurried and orderly, where routines settled into place like clockwork and rarely broke. Streets were lined with modest homes, each with trimmed hedges and soft porch lights that flickered on at dusk. Families gathered around dinner tables at predictable hours. Neighbors knew each other's names, their habits, their dogs. It was the kind of place where people believed they understood the boundaries of danger and, more importantly, believed those boundaries existed somewhere else. There was a rhythm to life here, something almost insulated. While larger cities wrestled with rising crime rates and shifting social tensions, Adelaide seemed to sit slightly apart, buffered by distance and by a quiet confidence in its own stability. Parents let their children walk home alone. Teenagers stayed out late without drawing much concern. The idea that something organized, something predatory, could operate beneath that calm surface felt incompatible with everything the city thought it knew about itself. But beneath that stillness, there were subtle shifts taking place, ones that didn't announce themselves loudly, but instead settled in gradually, almost imperceptibly. The late 1970s and early 1980s were a time of change, not just for Australia, but for communities like this one. Cultural norms were loosening in some places and tightening in others. Conversations about identity, sexuality, and power existed, but often in hushed tones, confined to private spaces where they could be safely contained. For many young men navigating that environment, especially those who felt different in ways they couldn't openly express, the world could feel both expansive and dangerously narrow at the same time. There were opportunities for connection, but they were often hidden, informal, and unprotected. Trust had to be given carefully, and sometimes, it was given to the wrong people. The geography of South Australia played its own quiet role in shaping the atmosphere. Beyond the city's comfortable neighborhoods, the landscape stretched outward into something far less predictable. Dry scrubland, winding backroads, and isolated pockets of terrain created spaces where visibility dropped away and distance became a kind of barrier. These were places where you could stand alone and feel entirely disconnected from the world you had just left behind. Places where sound didn't travel the way you expected it to. Where help, if it existed at all, felt impossibly far away. During the day, those outskirts could seem almost peaceful, even inviting. But at night, they transformed. The darkness there was different, thicker, more complete. It swallowed shapes and softened edges, turning familiar ground into something uncertain. For most people, those areas were simply avoided after sunset. But for others, they became something else entirely. They became useful. Within the city itself, there were locations that held their own kind of significance, parks that drew crowds during the day and emptied out after dusk, quiet streets where headlights were the only sign of movement. And certain gathering spots where people drifted in and out without attracting too much attention. These places weren't inherently dangerous, but they existed in that grey space where oversight was limited and anonymity was possible. And anonymity, in the wrong hands, can be a powerful tool. At the same time, Adelaide's social structure carried an undercurrent that rarely surfaced openly but influenced much of how the city functioned. There was a clear awareness of hierarchy of who held influence, who had connections, who could open doors or quietly close them. Business leaders, legal professionals, and individuals with established reputations moved within circles that overlapped in ways that weren't always visible from the outside. These networks weren't inherently sinister, but they created an environment where relationships mattered, where reputations were protected, and where certain questions could be deflected rather than answered. In a city this size, power didn't need to be loud to be effective. It could exist in small gestures, in unspoken understandings, in the quiet assurance that some things were better left alone. Law enforcement operated within that same environment. The police force in Adelaide was not unprepared or indifferent, but it was shaped by the expectations of the community it served. Cases were approached with the assumption that most incidents had straightforward explanations. Accidents, suicides, isolated acts of violence, these were categories that fit comfortably within the existing framework. They allowed for resolution, for closure, for the sense that order had been restored. But when a case didn't quite fit, when details resisted alignment, there was a natural tendency to smooth the edges, to guide the narrative toward something that made sense. Not out of malice, but out of habit. Out of a desire to maintain coherence in a world that depended on it. And so, when the first of these deaths occurred, it entered a system that wasn't yet prepared to see it for what it might be. A young man found dead under circumstances that raised questions, but not enough, at least initially, to demand a complete re-evaluation. There were explanations available, and they were accepted. The case moved forward, processed, filed. Then it happened again. Not in the same place, not with identical details, but close enough, similar enough, that a faint echo began to form. Still, it wasn't loud enough to break through the city's sense of normalcy. Each incident was handled on its own terms, each one contained within its own narrative. It's easy, in hindsight, to look back and connect the dots, to see the pattern emerging with clarity. But at the time, those dots were scattered, separated by time, by location, by subtle differences that made them easier to dismiss as coincidence. And yet, there were people who felt it. Not in a way they could articulate clearly, not in a way that could be written into reports or presented as evidence, but as a quiet unease that lingered beneath the surface of daily life. A sense that something didn't quite add up. That the city they trusted might be hiding something it didn't fully understand. For families, that unease was sharper. When a son didn't come home, when hours stretched into days, the calm assurances of the surrounding world offered little comfort. There was always that moment, early on, where hope still held, where explanations remained benign. Maybe he stayed with a friend. Maybe something unexpected came up. Maybe there was a simple reason that hadn't yet revealed itself. But as time passed, those possibilities began to thin. And in their place, questions took root. Where was he last seen? Who was he with? Why did the story feel incomplete? For some, answers came too late, and when they did, they arrived wrapped in uncertainty. Official conclusions that didn't quite align with instinct. Details that felt off, even if they couldn't be proven to be wrong. A lingering sense that the truth had been reduced to something more manageable, something easier to accept. And that's where the setting of this story becomes more than just a backdrop. Because Adelaide, in those years, wasn't just a place where these events occurred. It was an active participant in how they unfolded. Its quiet streets, its isolated outskirts, its social dynamics and unspoken rules, all of these elements combined to create an environment where something complex could exist without immediately being recognized. An environment where patterns could develop slowly, almost invisibly. An environment where those responsible, if they were indeed more than one, could operate with a level of confidence that came not from recklessness, but from understanding. Understanding of the terrain. Understanding of the people. Understanding of the system. There's a moment in every long-buried story when the setting itself begins to feel complicit, not in the sense of intention, but in the way it allowed certain things to happen without resistance. In the way it absorbed events and softened their edges until they could be explained away. And for Adelaide, that moment would come later. At first, it remained what it had always been, a city that believed in its own safety, its own predictability, its own distance from the kinds of darkness that existed elsewhere. But beneath that belief, something was already moving. Quietly. Patiently. Waiting for the moment when it would no longer be possible to ignore. They were not statistics when it began. They were not names grouped together under a single heading, not yet part of something that would later be whispered about as the family murders. They were just boys and young men, each moving through their own small, ordinary worlds in Adelaide, carrying futures that still felt open, undefined, and quietly hopeful in ways that rarely make it into official records. If you had passed Mark Langley on the street, you might not have remembered him a second time, and that is not an insult but a reflection of how normal he seemed. 18 years old, standing at that fragile threshold between adolescence and adulthood, he carried himself with the kind of loose confidence that comes from still figuring things out. His life wasn't dramatic. It wasn't marked by extremes. It was built from small routines, familiar faces, the kind of days that blend together until something breaks the pattern. At home, there were expectations, gentle but present. Conversations about what came next, about work, about direction. The future wasn't mapped out, but it was there, waiting for him to step into it. Friends knew him as someone easy to be around, someone who didn't demand attention but never felt invisible either. He existed comfortably in the spaces he occupied, not yet aware of how quickly those spaces could be taken away. There are always details that surface later, after everything has changed. The last time someone saw him laughing. The way he lingered a little longer than usual before leaving. The small decisions that, in hindsight, feel loaded with meaning even though they weren't at the time. On the day he disappeared, there was nothing outwardly unusual, nothing that would have signaled the shift that was about to happen. It was just another day, moving forward like any other. And then it wasn't. Neil Muir's world was different in some ways, but not in the ways that would have protected him. At 25, he was older, more experienced, someone who had already stepped into adulthood and begun shaping a life of his own. But that didn't make him immune. If anything, it placed him in a different kind of vulnerability, one that came from navigating a world where trust could be both necessary and dangerous. Neil moved through Adelaide with a quieter presence, someone who understood the rhythms of the city, who knew where people gathered and where they disappeared into the background. There was a sense of independence about him, but also something more guarded, as if he had learned early on that not everything should be shared openly. His life contained layers that didn't always overlap, circles that remained separate for reasons that were never fully explained. People who knew him described a complexity that didn't fit neatly into a single narrative. He could be warm, engaging, present, and then distant, withdrawn, as if part of him was always calculating, always aware of something just beyond the immediate moment. It's easy, after the fact, to interpret those qualities as signs, as indicators that something larger was at play. But at the time, they were simply part of who he was. When Neil's story ended, it did so in a way that erased clarity. Fire has a way of doing that, of stripping away detail and leaving behind only fragments. What remained raised more questions than it answered, and those questions would linger, unresolved, becoming part of a growing pattern that no one had yet fully acknowledged. And then there was Wayne. 15 years old, still firmly within the boundaries of childhood, even if he was beginning to test their edges. There's something especially difficult about trying to reconstruct the life of someone that young, because so much of it exists in potential rather than in memory. Dreams not yet articulated, paths not yet chosen, a sense of identity still forming. Wayne's world was smaller, more immediate. School, home, friends, the familiar roots that defined his daily life. He was at an age where independence feels like something to reach for, but not something fully possessed. Trust comes more easily, boundaries are still being learned, and the assumption that the world is fundamentally safe hasn't yet been broken. For his family, his presence was constant in the way that only a child's presence can be. The sound of him moving through the house, the small routines that mark time, meals, conversations, the quiet moments that don't seem significant until they're gone. There's a particular kind of silence that settles into a home after something like this happens, a silence that feels wrong, that doesn't belong. When Wayne was found, the explanation offered was one that demanded acceptance. It suggested a conclusion that, on the surface, seemed plausible enough to close the case. But beneath that surface, there were inconsistencies, details that didn't align, elements that resisted the simplicity of the narrative. For those who looked closely, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something unfinished. What connects these lives is not just the way they ended, but the way they existed before that point. They were not reckless in any extraordinary way. They were not actively seeking danger. They were living within the same framework as everyone else around them, making choices that, under normal circumstances, would have carried little risk. But something about them made them visible to the wrong kind of attention. It's tempting to search for a single defining trait, something that explains why these particular individuals were targeted. Age, vulnerability, circumstance, these factors come close, but they don't fully capture it. Because what stands out, more than anything, is how ordinary they were. How unremarkable their lives appeared from the outside. And that's what makes the pattern so unsettling. Because it suggests that the selection wasn't random, but it also wasn't obvious. It operated within a space that most people don't think to examine, a space where familiarity becomes a kind of camouflage. Where the absence of extremes makes it easier to blend in, easier to approach without raising suspicion. There are moments, when looking back at cases like this, where the victims begin to feel like they are being overshadowed by the mystery surrounding them. Their names become part of a larger narrative, their individual stories reduced to pieces of a puzzle that someone else is trying to solve. But before they were part of anything larger, they were simply themselves. Mark, stepping into adulthood with more questions than answers, but with time still on his side. Neil, navigating a more complex world, carrying experiences that shaped him in ways not everyone could see. Wayne, standing at the beginning of everything, his life still unfolding in directions no one had yet imagined. Each of them moved through Adelaide under the same sky, walked the same streets, trusted the same sense of normalcy that everyone else relied on. None of them could have known that their paths were being observed, that somewhere, someone was paying attention in a way that would eventually change everything. There's a quiet cruelty in that kind of attention. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't give warning. It waits, watches, and then acts at a moment when resistance is least expected. And afterward, it leaves behind questions that don't just belong to investigators or to the public, but to the families who are left trying to reconcile the people they knew with the circumstances of their loss. What happened in those final hours? Who were they with? Did they understand, even briefly, what was happening? These are questions that don't fade with time. They settle in, becoming part of the memory of the person who is gone, reshaping how they are remembered, how they are spoken about, how they are held on to. For the families, the absence is not abstract. It is specific, tied to moments that no longer occur, to spaces that feel incomplete. A chair that remains empty. A room that stays closed. A name that is spoken differently, carrying a weight it didn't have before. And for the city, whether it realized it at the time or not, something had begun to shift. Because when lives like these are taken in ways that don't make sense, it challenges the assumptions that hold everything together. It forces a confrontation with the possibility that danger doesn't always look the way it's expected to. That it can exist within the familiar, within the ordinary, within the very structures that are meant to provide safety. The stories of Mark, Neil, and Wayne are not complete. They are fragments, interrupted narratives that leave space where there should be continuity. But in those fragments, there are traces of something larger, something that extends beyond any single life. Something that was already moving through Adelaide, quietly selecting, quietly shaping outcomes, leaving behind just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be fully understood. Not yet. Night didn't fall suddenly over Adelaide. It crept in, slow and almost polite, dimming the edges of buildings, softening the outlines of trees, turning familiar streets into something slightly less certain. Porch lights flickered on one by one, small islands of yellow in the gathering dark. Cars passed, their headlights cutting brief tunnels through the night before disappearing again. It was the kind of evening that didn't ask for attention, the kind people moved through without thinking. For Mark Langley, that night began like so many others. There was no dramatic departure, No lingering sense that something was about to shift. Just a decision to go out, to step into the city and whatever it might offer. At 18, the night still carried a sense of possibility, of small freedoms that felt larger than they really were. Conversations that might happen, people that might be met, places that might lead to something unexpected. He moved through the city with the ease of someone who believed, as most did, that the rules were understood. That there were lines you didn't cross, situations you avoided, instincts you trusted when something felt off. And for a while, those instincts held. The streets were alive enough to feel safe, quiet enough to feel personal. There were other people around, other lives intersecting briefly before moving on. At some point, though, the pattern changed. It's impossible to pinpoint the exact moment, the precise second when an ordinary night begins to tilt into something else. It could have been a conversation that lingered longer than it should have. A face that seemed friendly enough, familiar enough, to lower defenses. An offer that didn't feel threatening, just slightly outside the usual routine. Maybe it was a car pulling up alongside the curb, the window rolling down, a voice calling out with casual confidence. Maybe it was laughter, shared just long enough to create a sense of connection. The details are lost, or perhaps they were never fully known to begin with. What matters is that at some point, Mark stepped into a space where control shifted. Not abruptly. Not in a way that would have triggered immediate alarm. But gradually, subtly, like a current pulling just beneath the surface. The kind of shift that's easy to ignore at first, easy to rationalize. Until it's too late. The city around him continued as it always did. People went home, lights went out, the rhythm of the night settling into its quieter phase. Somewhere beyond the visible streets, beyond the reach of casual observation, something else was unfolding. A different kind of interaction. One where the balance of power had already been decided. The same pattern, in different forms, touched the lives of others. Neil Muir's final hours carried a different texture, shaped by experience, by a deeper familiarity with the spaces he moved through. If Mark's night was defined by the openness of youth, Neil's was marked by something more measured, more aware. He understood, perhaps better than most, that not every invitation came without risk, that not every encounter was as simple as it appeared. And yet, even with that awareness, he found himself drawn into a situation that slipped beyond his control. There are moments when familiarity becomes a vulnerability, when knowing the landscape, the people, the unspoken rules, creates a false sense of security. Neil had navigated those spaces before. He had made choices, taken risks, and come out the other side. There was no reason to believe that this time would be different. Until it was. The transition, again, was not immediate. It unfolded in stages, each one building on the last, each one narrowing the range of possible outcomes. A location that felt slightly more isolated than expected. A tone that shifted, just enough to register but not enough to provoke immediate action. A realization, creeping in slowly, that the situation was no longer what it seemed. By the time that realization fully formed, options had already begun to close. What happened next exists in fragments, in forensic traces and inferences drawn from what was left behind. But within those fragments, there is a sense of escalation, of events moving beyond anything that could be reversed. Control, once taken, was not relinquished. It was exercised, deliberately, with an understanding of how far it could go. And then, as with the others, there was an attempt to reshape the narrative. To transform what had happened into something else. Something that could be explained. Something that could be filed away. Wayne's story carries a different weight, not because of what happened, but because of who he was when it did. 15 years old, still anchored to the structures of childhood, still moving within a world that was supposed to be safer, more contained. His final hours began in a space that should have been familiar, predictable. There is a particular vulnerability in that kind of familiarity. It lowers defenses in ways that are difficult to counter. When everything around you feels known, when the environment doesn't signal danger, it becomes harder to recognize when something is wrong. Wayne's path that day did not begin with risk. It began with routine. A sequence of events that, under normal circumstances, would have led him back home, back to the life that was still unfolding around him. But somewhere along that path, something intervened. A presence. An interaction. A moment that redirected everything that followed. For someone his age, the ability to assess that shift, to respond to it effectively, is limited. Trust comes more easily. Authority, or the appearance of it, carries more weight. The line between safe and unsafe is still being learned, still being tested. And that line was crossed. What followed was not chaotic. It did not spiral out of control in a way that might have left clear, unmistakable evidence. Instead, it moved with a kind of precision that suggests planning, intention, an understanding of how to manage not just the act itself, but its aftermath. The scene that was eventually presented told a story. A simple one. A tragic one. But a story that, on closer inspection, didn't quite hold together. Across these incidents, there is a consistency that becomes harder to ignore the more closely you look. Not in the superficial details, which vary enough to create the illusion of separation, but in the underlying structure. The way each event begins in normalcy, shifts gradually into something else, and then concludes with an attempt to reframe what occurred. It's a pattern built on control. Control over the victim. Control over the environment. Control over the narrative that follows. And perhaps most unsettling of all, control over how much of the truth is ever revealed. Because in each case, there is a point where clarity should emerge. Where the sequence of events should align, where cause and effect should become visible, where the story should resolve into something coherent. But instead, there are gaps. Moments that cannot be fully reconstructed. Decisions that don't quite make sense. Details that seem out of place, as if they belong to a different version of events that was never fully uncovered. Those gaps are not empty. They are filled with possibility. Possibility that what happened was not spontaneous, not isolated, not the result of a single individual acting alone. Possibility that there were others involved, whether directly or indirectly. Possibility that the events of those nights were part of something larger, something that extended beyond any single location, any single victim. And if that's true, then the incidents themselves are only one part of the story. The visible part. The part that leaves behind evidence, that can be examined, questioned, debated. But beneath that, there is another layer. One that exists in the choices made before the act. In the selection of victims. In the coordination required to carry out something like this more than once, without immediate detection. That layer is harder to access. Harder to prove. But it's there, suggested by the consistency, by the repetition, by the sense that these events were not random interruptions in the fabric of the city, but deliberate actions carried out with a purpose that has never been fully explained. And that is where the horror deepens. Because it shifts the focus from what happened in those final hours to the possibility that those hours were only the end of a much longer process. One that began earlier. One that may have involved more people. One that was designed, from the beginning, to leave as little trace as possible. The nights in Adelaide continued, as they always did. People went out, met friends, returned home. The city maintained its rhythm, its sense of normalcy. But beneath that surface, these incidents were accumulating, forming a pattern that had not yet been fully recognized. Each one adding weight. Each one adding urgency. Each one bringing the truth a little closer to the point where it could no longer be contained. But in those early moments, in the immediate aftermath of each event, that truth remained just out of reach. Hidden behind carefully constructed scenes. Buried beneath explanations that almost made sense. Waiting for someone to look closer. To question more deeply. To see not just what was presented, but what was missing. Because in those missing pieces, in the spaces where the story breaks down, that's where the real narrative begins to emerge. And it's far more complex, far more deliberate, than anyone was ready to accept. The first thing people remember about a scene like that is not what they see, but what they feel. A subtle shift in the air, a weight that settles into the chest before the mind has time to explain it. Out in the quieter edges of Adelaide, where the roads narrow and the land stretches into dry scrub, that feeling arrives faster, more sharply, as if the isolation itself is trying to communicate something. When Mark Langley was found, the setting did not immediately declare violence. It suggested something else, something contained, almost private. The kind of scene that, at a glance, invites a conclusion rather than a question. There was no obvious sign of struggle spread across a wide area, no chaotic scattering of evidence that would force investigators to consider a more complex narrative right away. Instead, everything appeared arranged. Not in a way that was theatrical or exaggerated, but in small, controlled details. The position of the body. The absence of disturbance in the surrounding environment. The subtle alignment of elements that, taken individually, meant little, but together began to form a pattern that felt too deliberate to ignore. The initial response followed protocol. Officers moved through the scene methodically, documenting, observing, collecting. Photographs captured angles that would later be revisited again and again, each time with a slightly different interpretation. Notes were taken, measurements recorded, timelines estimated. At first, the working assumption leaned toward a conclusion that fit within familiar boundaries. A tragic but explainable outcome. Something that could be understood without requiring a broader re-evaluation. But as the details accumulated, that assumption began to weaken. There were inconsistencies. Not large enough to immediately overturn the narrative, but persistent enough to resist being dismissed. The condition of the body suggested factors that did not align cleanly with the initial theory. There were indications, subtle, but present, that something had occurred prior to the final moment, something that had not been accounted for. Toxicology would later deepen those questions. Substances found within Mark's system did not belong naturally to the story that had first been proposed. Their presence implied intervention, an external influence that shifted the context from internal decision to something imposed. And yet, even with those findings, the scene itself did not offer a clear alternative explanation. It remained controlled, contained, as if whatever had happened had been carefully managed to leave behind just enough to support one interpretation, while obscuring others. Neil Muir's discovery carried a different kind of disturbance. Fire changes everything. It consumes detail, distorts evidence, and leaves behind a landscape that feels both revealing and concealing at the same time. When his body was found, the immediate impression was one of destruction, of an event that had erased as much as it had exposed. But even within that destruction, patterns remained. Investigators moved through the remnants with caution, aware that what they were seeing was only a partial record of what had occurred. Burn patterns, residue, the positioning of what survived, all of it became part of a reconstruction effort that relied as much on inference as on direct observation. There were questions about the origin of the fire, about how it started, how it spread, how it interacted with the environment around it. Those questions did not settle easily. The evidence pointed in multiple directions, none of them fully satisfying, none of them entirely conclusive. What stood out, however, was the sense that the fire had a purpose beyond destruction. It had altered the scene in ways that complicated the narrative, that introduced ambiguity where there might otherwise have been clarity. It had, intentionally or not, created distance between the event and its interpretation. And within that distance, uncertainty took hold. Wayne's case presented a scene that, on the surface, appeared even more straightforward. A location that suggested a singular act, a conclusion that seemed to follow a known pattern. The kind of discovery that, under normal circumstances, might not trigger extensive scrutiny. But normal circumstances rely on consistency. And by the time Wayne was found, there were already enough inconsistencies in other cases to cast a shadow over even the most seemingly clear-cut situations. The position of his body, the surrounding environment, the small details that often go unnoticed, these became points of focus. Investigators began to look more closely, not just at what was present, but at what was absent. Signs that should have been there but weren't. Indicators that suggested movement, intervention, staging. The deeper they looked, the less comfortable the initial explanation became. Across these scenes, separated by time and location, a quiet thread began to emerge. It wasn't immediately visible, not in a way that could be easily articulated, but it was there in the repetition of certain elements. The controlled nature of the environments. The subtle discrepancies between appearance and evidence. The presence of factors that pointed toward external involvement without definitively proving it. It was enough to create doubt. And doubt, once introduced, has a way of expanding. Forensic teams revisited their findings, re-examining samples, questioning earlier conclusions. Conversations shifted in tone, moving from certainty to speculation, from resolution to inquiry. The idea that these cases might be connected began to surface more frequently, though it remained just out of reach of formal acknowledgement. There were practical challenges as well. Each scene had been processed within its own context, its own timeline, its own set of assumptions. Bringing them together required a re-evaluation not just of evidence, but of approach. It meant looking at familiar details through a different lens, one that allowed for the possibility of coordination, of pattern, of intent that extended beyond a single. And that kind of shift does not happen easily. It requires someone to step back, to question the framework itself, to consider that what has been accepted might be incomplete. As more information was gathered, certain elements began to stand out with greater clarity. The presence of substances that suggested incapacitation. The lack of defensive injuries in situations where they might be expected. The positioning of bodies in ways that implied placement rather than collapse. These were not definitive answers, but they were indicators. Indicators that something had happened before the final moment. Indicators that control had been exerted, maintained, and then concealed. Outside the immediate scope of forensic analysis, other details began to surface. Witness accounts, often fragmented and inconsistent, but occasionally aligning in ways that were difficult to ignore. Reports of unfamiliar vehicles in areas where they did not belong. Observations of interactions that seemed ordinary at the time but took on new significance in retrospect. Each piece, on its own, was insufficient. Together, they began to form a mosaic that hinted at something larger. Something organized. Something that operated with an understanding of how to avoid detection, how to manipulate perception, how to leave behind just enough to satisfy initial inquiry while obscuring deeper truths. The challenge for investigators was not just to gather evidence, but to interpret it within a framework that could accommodate that possibility. To move beyond isolated incidents and consider the potential for connection, for coordination, for a pattern that had not yet been fully defined. And as that possibility grew, so did the stakes. Because if these scenes were not independent, if they were part of a broader sequence, then the implications extended far beyond any single case. It meant that the threat was ongoing, that the individuals responsible, whether one or many, had not been stopped. It meant that the next scene had not yet been discovered. Back in Adelaide, life continued with its usual rhythm. People went about their days, largely unaware of the quiet shift taking place within the investigative community. But for those working the cases, for those who had seen the scenes up close, who had traced the outlines of evidence and felt the weight of what didn't fit, the sense of urgency was growing. The scenes were no longer just places where something had happened. They were messages. Carefully constructed, deliberately incomplete, waiting to be understood. And somewhere within those messages, hidden between what was visible and what was missing, was the key to everything that followed. But finding it would require more than observation. It would require the willingness to see beyond what was presented. To question not just the evidence, but the narrative built around it. To accept that the truth might be more complex, more unsettling, than anyone had initially believed. And once that door was opened, there would be no closing it again. By the time the investigations began to overlap in the minds of a few persistent detectives, the damage had already been done not just to the victims, but to the integrity of the cases themselves. Each death had entered the system alone, processed within its own narrative, shaped by initial assumptions that were now proving difficult to undo. In Adelaide, the idea that these incidents might be connected did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived slowly, reluctantly, resisted at every step by the structure that had already been built around them. Inside police offices, under the dim hum of fluorescent lights, files began to stack in ways they hadn't before. Not physically at first, but conceptually. Names that had once existed in separate folders started to appear in the same conversations. Details that had seemed incidental began to echo across cases. The repetition was subtle, but it was there, threading through the evidence like something half-hidden, waiting to be acknowledged. The first attempts to connect the dots were cautious. Investigators compared timelines, locations, forensic findings. They looked for overlap in movement, in witness statements, in any detail that might suggest coordination. But every time a connection seemed within reach, something disrupted it. A missing piece. A contradiction. A gap that could not be filled with certainty. And so the cases hovered in an uncomfortable space, too similar to ignore, too incomplete to definitively link. Suspects emerged, as they always do. Some were obvious, pulled in by proximity or by behavior that raised immediate suspicion. Individuals who had crossed paths with the victims shortly before their deaths. People who had been seen in the wrong place at the wrong time. Names that surfaced quickly, investigated thoroughly, and then, more often than not, faded just as quickly when evidence failed to hold. There were men who fit the profile of opportunistic offenders, those who might act alone, driven by impulse rather than planning. But the scenes did not support that kind of randomness. There was too much control, too much consistency in the aftermath. These were not acts that spiraled out of control. They were contained, managed, directed. That realization narrowed the field, but it also complicated it. Because if the perpetrator or perpetrators were operating with that level of precision, they were unlikely to be easily identified through conventional means. They would not stand out in obvious ways. They would blend in, move through the same spaces as everyone else, carry on with lives that appeared unremarkable from the outside. And that made them harder to see. Witnesses, when they could be found, offered fragments. A face glimpsed briefly under streetlight. A car idling where it shouldn't have been. A conversation that felt slightly off, though not enough at the time to trigger alarm. These accounts were inconsistent, sometimes contradictory, often shaped by memory that had begun to fade or shift. Still, patterns began to form even within those inconsistencies. Descriptions of vehicles that appeared more than once, though never in exactly the same way. Individuals who seemed to move between different social circles, appearing just long enough to establish familiarity before disappearing again. There was a sense of mobility, of fluidity, as if whoever was involved understood how to navigate the city without leaving a fixed trace. And then there were the rumors. They didn't appear in official reports, not at first. They circulated quietly, passed between people who trusted each other enough to speak, but not enough to risk being heard by the wrong audience. Rumors of gatherings. Of networks that operated behind closed doors. Of individuals with influence, businessmen, professionals whose names carried weight in public, but were spoken differently in private. These rumors suggested something more than a lone offender. They hinted at a group. Not a formal organization, not something that could be easily defined or exposed, but a loose network of individuals connected by shared interests, shared secrets, and perhaps shared participation in activities that could not withstand scrutiny. For investigators, engaging with these rumors was risky. They lacked concrete evidence. They relied on sources that were often reluctant, fearful, or inconsistent. And most importantly, they pointed toward people who were not easily investigated, individuals with resources, with connections, with the ability to influence how far certain inquiries could go. Still, the possibility could not be ignored. Because it aligned, in unsettling ways, with what the evidence was already suggesting. Control. Coordination. Consistency. These were not the hallmarks of isolated acts. They were indicators of something structured, something that extended beyond a single individual's capacity. As the investigation deepened, attention began to focus on one name more than others, Bevan Spencer von Einem. He did not emerge immediately as the central figure. His name surfaced gradually, tied to specific details that became harder to dismiss over time. Connections to individuals within certain social circles. Associations that placed him within reach of environments where victims might have been encountered. Behavioral patterns that, while not overtly incriminating on their own, began to take on new significance when viewed alongside the broader context. Von Einem was not an obvious suspect in the traditional sense. He did not fit neatly into a single category. There was nothing about him that immediately signaled the kind of violence being investigated. And perhaps that was part of what made him so difficult to assess. He existed within the same framework as everyone else, moving through the city, interacting with others, maintaining a presence that did not attract undue attention. But beneath that surface, there were indications of something more complex, something that did not align with the image he presented. Investigators began to look more closely. They examined his movements, his associations, his history. They searched for points of contact, for moments where his path might have intersected with those of the victims. Some connections were circumstantial, others more direct. None of them, at least initially, were enough to build a definitive case. And yet, his name kept returning, like a thread that refused to be cut. At the same time, the idea that he might not be acting alone gained traction. There were too many elements that suggested collaboration, or at least facilitation. Access to locations. The ability to move without drawing attention. The consistency across scenes that implied shared knowledge or shared methods. If von Einem was involved, the question became not just what he had done, but who else might be connected to him. That question led investigators into increasingly complex territory. They began to map relationships, to trace connections between individuals who might, on the surface, have had little in common. Social events, professional ties, informal networks, these became points of interest. The investigation expanded outward, not just looking for a single perpetrator, but for a structure that could support the kind of activity being uncovered. And with that expansion came resistance. Not always direct, not always visible, but present nonetheless. Requests for information that stalled without clear explanation. Leads that seemed promising but dissolved under scrutiny. A sense that certain areas were more difficult to penetrate than others, that some questions were harder to pursue. Whether that resistance was intentional or simply a byproduct of complexity remained unclear. But its effect was undeniable. It slowed progress. It introduced doubt. It created space for alternative explanations to persist, even as evidence began to point in a different direction. For the families of the victims, this phase of the investigation was perhaps the most difficult. Hope, once anchored in the belief that answers would come, began to waver. The process stretched on, moving forward in increments that felt too small, too uncertain. Each new development brought with it the possibility of resolution, but also the risk of disappointment. And often, that risk became reality. Suspects were investigated and released. Leads were followed and abandoned. The narrative shifted, adjusted, reconfigured, but never fully settled into something that could be called complete. Meanwhile, the underlying pattern remained. Unresolved. Persistent. A series of deaths that, taken together, suggested something far more deliberate than anyone had initially been willing to accept. And as investigators continued to navigate that pattern, to push against the limitations of evidence and structure, one question began to take precedence over all others. Not just who was responsible, but how many. Because the answer to that question would determine everything that followed. It would define the scope of the case, the nature of the threat, and the possibility, however distant, of bringing it to an end. There is a moment in every long investigation when the weight of uncertainty becomes too heavy to carry forward unchanged. A moment when scattered details, half-formed suspicions, and quiet patterns begin to align not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough to shift the direction of everything that follows. In the case that would come to be known as the family murders, that moment did not arrive with clarity. It arrived with friction. Inside interview rooms and behind closed office doors in Adelaide, investigators began to press harder. The earlier caution, the careful balancing between competing theories, started to give way to something more deliberate. They had reached a point where continuing as before, treating each case as a separate entity, allowing inconsistencies to remain unresolved, was no longer viable. The pattern had grown too persistent, too insistent. And at the center of that shifting focus, one name refused to move. Bevan Spencer von Einem. He was no longer just a peripheral figure, no longer a name that surfaced and disappeared without consequence. The investigation had circled back to him too many times, from too many angles, for that to be coincidence. Each return added another layer, not definitive proof, but pressure. Enough pressure that ignoring it became more difficult than confronting it. The breakthrough did not come from a single piece of evidence. It came from accumulation. Fragments that had once seemed unrelated began to overlap. Witness statements, previously dismissed as unreliable or incomplete, started to align in small but significant ways. Descriptions that once felt vague took on sharper outlines when placed side by side. Timelines that had gaps began to narrow, revealing moments where movement, opportunity, and presence intersected. There was also a shift in how information was interpreted. Earlier, discrepancies had been treated as obstacles, problems to be resolved or explained away. Now, they were being treated as signals. Indicators that something within the existing narrative was incorrect, incomplete, or deliberately shaped. Instead of forcing the evidence to fit a known conclusion, investigators began allowing the inconsistencies to guide them toward a different one. And that shift changed everything. It opened the door to possibilities that had previously been considered too complex, too difficult to prove, or too disruptive to pursue. Possibilities involving more than one person, more than one role. A structure that extended beyond a single individual's actions into something that resembled coordination. Within that framework, von Einem's position became more defined. Not necessarily as the sole architect, but as a central figure, someone who connected different elements, who moved between spaces that others could not easily access, who maintained relationships that spanned across the very networks investigators were beginning to map. There were moments in the interrogation process where this became particularly evident. He did not present as someone overwhelmed by the weight of suspicion. There was no immediate collapse, no clear admission, no sudden unraveling under pressure. Instead, there was control. Measured responses. A careful navigation of questions that suggested not just awareness, but preparation. Silences, when they occurred, did not feel like gaps. They felt intentional. Answers, when given, often addressed the surface of the question without touching its core. Details were acknowledged, but rarely expanded upon. There was a sense of movement without progress, of engagement without revelation. For experienced investigators, this kind of behavior carries its own meaning. It suggests familiarity with the process. It suggests an understanding of what can be said, what should be avoided, and how to maintain a position within that narrow space where cooperation appears present, but information remains limited. At the same time, external pressure was building. Media attention, once sporadic and uncertain, began to focus more consistently on the emerging connections. Public awareness grew, not in explosive bursts, but in steady increments. Questions that had once been confined to investigative circles began to surface more openly. How many cases were truly connected? Who was responsible? And why did it feel like the answers were still just out of reach? Within the investigation, a critical development began to take shape through the re-examination of forensic evidence. Advances in analysis, combined with a willingness to revisit earlier conclusions, led to a deeper understanding of what had been overlooked. Substances found in victim systems were reassessed, not as isolated anomalies, but as part of a pattern. The presence of certain chemicals suggested incapacitation, not accidental, not self-administered, but controlled. This reframed the events leading up to the deaths, shifting them from spontaneous outcomes to stages within a larger sequence. That sequence implied planning. It implied access. It implied knowledge of how to manage not just the act itself, but the body's response to it. And that knowledge was not common. It pointed toward individuals who understood more than they should have about physiology, about timing, about how to maintain control without leaving obvious signs of struggle. As these findings solidified, the gap between suspicion and action began to close. Investigators moved from observation to strategy. Surveillance intensified. Associations were tracked more closely. Financial records, communication patterns, social interactions all became part of a broader effort to construct a comprehensive picture. And within that picture, the lines between individuals began to blur. Connections that had once seemed coincidental started to form networks. Shared acquaintances. Overlapping locations. Events where multiple figures of interest had been present, even if only briefly. The sense of isolation that had once defined each case began to dissolve, replaced by an emerging structure that suggested coordination. Not overt, not formal, but present. This was the point where the investigation became something else entirely. No longer just a search for a perpetrator, but an attempt to understand a system. A system that operated within the boundaries of normal life, that used familiarity as cover, that relied on trust, access, and discretion to function. And systems, by their nature, are harder to dismantle than individuals. Because removing one element does not necessarily collapse the whole. That realization introduced a new kind of urgency. If von Einem was involved, then his role needed to be defined not just in terms of what he had done, but in terms of how he fit into the broader structure. Was he acting alone in some instances and with others in different contexts? Was he a participant within a larger network, or something closer to a coordinator? The answers to those questions remained elusive. But the investigation had reached a point where waiting for certainty was no longer an option. Action had to be taken. The decision to move forward was not made lightly. It came after months, years of accumulation, of revisiting, of challenging earlier assumptions. It came with the understanding that the case being built might not capture the full scope of what had occurred. But it was enough. Enough to bring charges. Enough to force the issue into a space where it could no longer remain fragmented and uncertain. And when that step was taken, when the investigation crossed from inquiry into prosecution, everything shifted again. Because now, the story would no longer be shaped solely by those trying to uncover it. It would be tested, challenged, presented in a form that demanded coherence, even if the truth itself resisted it. For the families, this moment carried a fragile sense of hope. Not certainty, not closure, but movement. The possibility that the long stretch of unanswered questions might finally lead somewhere tangible. For investigators, it marked both an achievement and a limitation. They had pushed the case as far as the evidence allowed. They had identified a central figure, constructed a narrative, built a framework that could be presented and defended. But beneath that framework, the larger questions remained. Unresolved. Lingering. Suggesting that what had been uncovered might only be part of a much deeper, more complex reality. And as the case moved toward the courtroom, toward its most visible phase, that reality did not disappear. It waited. Just beyond the edges of what could be proven. Just outside the reach of what could be said with certainty. A reminder that even breakthroughs have limits. And that sometimes, the truth does not arrive all at once, but in pieces, each one revealing just enough to show how much is still missing. By the time the case entered the courtroom in Adelaide, it carried more than just evidence. It carried years of uncertainty, fragments of stories that refused to align, and the weight of questions that had already begun to outgrow the structure meant to contain them. Trials are supposed to bring order to chaos, to take the scattered pieces of an investigation and assemble them into something coherent, something that can be understood, judged, and concluded. But this case resisted that kind of order. From the very beginning, there was a tension in the room that went beyond the usual gravity of a murder trial. It wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about scope. About whether what was being presented was the full truth, or only a portion of it shaped into something that could fit within legal boundaries. At the center of it all sat Bevan Spencer von Einem. He did not appear as the kind of figure people expect when they think of violence on this scale. There was no outward display of instability, no obvious fracture in his demeanor. He sat with a stillness that could be interpreted in multiple ways: composure, detachment, calculation. His expressions revealed little, and when they did shift, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, as if every reaction had been measured in advance. The prosecution's task was both straightforward and impossibly complex. They were not attempting to prove the entirety of what had come to be known as the family murders. That scope extended too far, into areas where evidence blurred and certainty dissolved. Instead, they focused on a single case, one that provided enough tangible detail to build a narrative that could withstand scrutiny. The murder of Richard Kelvin became the anchor. Through it, the prosecution sought to establish not just an act, but a pattern of behavior. They presented evidence of control, of planning, of a sequence of events that did not align with spontaneity or accident. Testimony described interactions that, when viewed in isolation, might have seemed ordinary, but when placed within the broader context, suggested something far more deliberate. Witnesses took the stand, each carrying their own piece of the story. Some spoke with clarity, their recollections sharp and consistent. Others struggled, their memories shaped by time, by fear, by the knowledge of what had happened since. The courtroom became a space where these fragments were assembled, tested, challenged. There were moments when the narrative seemed to hold. Moments when the sequence of events felt solid, when the connections between evidence and conclusion appeared clear. In those moments, the case took on a shape that was almost reassuring in its coherence. And then, just as quickly, that coherence would fracture. The defense moved carefully, not with dramatic gestures, but with precision. They did not need to dismantle the entire case. They only needed to introduce doubt, to highlight inconsistencies, to question the reliability of witnesses, the interpretation of evidence, the assumptions that underpinned the prosecution's narrative. They pointed to gaps. Moments where the timeline was unclear. Details that could be interpreted in more than one way. The absence of direct evidence linking von Einem to every aspect of the sequence being described. It was a strategy that did not seek to provide an alternative explanation so much as to weaken the existing one. And in a case like this, that was often enough. Because the standard was not suspicion. It was certainty. For the families of the victims, the courtroom was a place of both hope and confrontation. They sat through testimony that revisited details many of them had tried, unsuccessfully, to reconcile in their own minds. They listened as their loved ones' final hours were reconstructed, debated, reduced to evidence and argument. There is a particular kind of pain in that process. To have a life distilled into a series of facts. To hear moments of fear, of confusion, of vulnerability described in clinical terms. To know that the person being discussed is no longer there to speak for themselves. And beneath that, a quieter, more persistent question. Is this all of it? Is this everything that happened? Or is there more, just beyond what can be proven? As the trial progressed, that question never fully left the room. Even as the prosecution built its case, even as the defense challenged it, there was a sense that something larger remained unaddressed. The connections to other deaths, the patterns that extended beyond the single charge being examined, the possibility of additional individuals involved, these hovered at the edges of the proceedings, acknowledged but not fully explored. The legal process, by its nature, requires focus. It demands boundaries. It cannot easily accommodate the kind of complexity that this case seemed to contain. And so, what was presented was necessarily incomplete. Not false, not misleading, but partial. A version of events shaped by what could be demonstrated, what could be argued, what could be supported by evidence that met the required standard. When the verdict came, it brought a form of resolution. Bevan Spencer von Einem was found guilty of murder. The decision was based on the evidence presented, on the narrative that had been constructed within the courtroom, on the arguments that had been tested and upheld. It was, in legal terms, a conclusion. But outside the courtroom, the response was more complicated. For some, it was a moment of relief. A confirmation that at least one act of violence had been acknowledged, addressed, and judged. A step toward accountability, however limited. For others, it felt incomplete. Because the conviction did not answer all the questions that had been raised over the course of the investigation. It did not fully address the patterns that had linked multiple deaths. It did not definitively resolve the possibility that von Einem had not acted alone. And perhaps most importantly, it did not bring closure in the way people had hoped. Closure implies an ending. A sense that the story has been fully told, that the truth has been uncovered, that there is nothing left to discover. This case did not offer that. Instead, it provided a point of certainty within a much larger field of uncertainty. A single, defined outcome surrounded by unanswered questions. In the aftermath of the trial, attention turned briefly toward the possibility of further action. Additional charges, expanded investigations, deeper inquiries into the networks that had been suggested but not fully exposed. But those efforts faced the same challenges that had been present from the beginning. Limited evidence. Fragmented information. Resistance, whether structural or circumstantial, that made it difficult to move beyond what had already been established. And so, the case settled into a kind of uneasy equilibrium. One man convicted. Multiple deaths still unresolved. A pattern recognized, but not fully explained. Within South Australia, the impact lingered. Not as a constant presence, but as something that resurfaced periodically, in conversations, in reports, in the quiet acknowledgement that there were aspects of this story that had never been fully uncovered. The courtroom had done what it was designed to do. It had examined the evidence available. It had reached a conclusion based on that evidence. But it had not, and perhaps could not, capture the entirety of what had occurred. And in that gap, between what was proven and what was suspected, the true weight of the case remained. Unresolved. Persistent. A reminder that justice, in its formal sense, does not always align with the full complexity of truth. And that sometimes, even after a verdict is delivered, the story is not finished. It simply changes form. Years pass differently for cases like this. Time does not smooth them out or push them gently into the past. Instead, it stretches them, pulls at their edges, exposes new angles while leaving the center stubbornly out of reach. In Adelaide, life moved forward the way it always does. Streets filled and emptied, houses changed hands, new families settled into old routines. On the surface, nothing remained of what had happened in those years between 1979 and 1983. But absence is not the same as resolution. For the families, time did not close anything. It simply added distance between who their sons were and who they had become in public memory. Names like Mark, Neil, Wayne, once spoken in kitchens, in laughter, in ordinary moments, began to carry a different weight. They were no longer just remembered as individuals. They became part of something larger, something that overshadowed the details of who they had been. And that transformation is its own kind of loss. Because when a case remains incomplete, the people at its center are often remembered through the lens of what happened to them, rather than who they were before it did. Their stories become fragmented, interrupted, held in place by unanswered questions that refuse to settle. In the years after the conviction of Bevan Spencer von Einem, there were moments when it seemed like the case might reopen in a meaningful way. New leads surfaced, or at least appeared to. Individuals came forward with information that had not been shared before, or had not been taken seriously at the time. Journalists revisited the files, pulling at threads that had once seemed too thin to follow. Each time, there was a brief resurgence of attention. A sense that perhaps this was the moment when the remaining pieces would fall into place. But those moments passed. Not because there was nothing there, but because what was there resisted consolidation. Information contradicted itself. Witnesses changed their accounts, or withdrew them entirely. Evidence that might have been decisive no longer existed, or had degraded beyond usefulness. The distance created by time, instead of clarifying, often complicated things further. And so the case settled into a different kind of existence. Not active, not closed, but suspended. Existing in archives, in memories, in the quiet spaces between what is known and what is suspected. Within South Australia, the legacy of what became known as the family murders is not always visible, but it is present. It surfaces in the way people talk about that period, in the caution that lingers in certain conversations, in the recognition that something significant happened and was never fully resolved. It also exists in the questions that remain. Not just about who was responsible, but about how it was possible. How multiple young men could be taken, harmed, and returned in ways that suggested control and planning, without immediate detection. How scenes could be constructed with enough precision to delay suspicion. How patterns could form slowly, almost invisibly, within a community that believed itself to be safe. And perhaps most unsettling of all, how the possibility of multiple individuals involved could remain unproven, even as it continued to be suggested by the evidence. These are not questions that fade easily. They persist because they challenge assumptions. About safety. About visibility. About the systems in place to recognize and respond to danger. There is also a broader implication that extends beyond the specifics of this case. The idea that harm does not always come from the margins, from the easily identifiable or the obviously dangerous. Sometimes, it exists within the familiar. Within networks that appear ordinary from the outside. Within relationships that do not immediately raise concern. That possibility is difficult to confront, because it requires a different way of seeing. A willingness to question not just individuals, but structures. Not just actions, but patterns. And in doing so, it introduces a level of uncertainty that people are often reluctant to accept. For those who continue to study the case, whether as investigators, journalists, or simply individuals drawn to its unresolved nature, there is a tension that never fully disappears. The desire to find answers is balanced against the recognition that some answers may no longer be accessible. That does not mean the effort is without value. Because even when a case cannot be fully resolved, it can still be understood more clearly. Patterns can be identified. Mistakes can be recognized. Systems can be adjusted to prevent similar outcomes in the future. In that sense, the story does not end with the absence of closure. It shifts. From a search for definitive answers to a broader examination of what can be learned. But for the families, for those who lost someone in a way that was never fully explained, that shift offers only partial comfort. Understanding is not the same as resolution. Recognition is not the same as justice. And learning, while important, does not undo what has been done. There is a quiet resilience in the way they carry that reality. Not always visible, not always expressed, but present in the continuation of memory. In the refusal to let the names become abstract, to let the individuals be reduced entirely to the circumstances of their deaths. Because at the center of everything, beyond the investigation, beyond the trial, beyond the theories and the speculation, there are still lives that were interrupted. Still stories that were left unfinished. Still moments that never had the chance to happen. And perhaps that is where the most important reflection lies. Not in the mystery itself, but in the recognition of what was lost within it. The case, with all its complexity, all its unanswered questions, all its lingering implications, serves as a reminder of how fragile certainty can be. How easily assumptions can be challenged. How much can exist beneath the surface of what appears to be ordinary. It also serves as a warning. That patterns, when they are subtle, when they are obscured by familiarity, can persist longer than they should. That attention, when it is delayed, can come at a cost. That the absence of clear answers does not mean the absence of truth. Somewhere within the layers of this story, that truth still exists. Not fully visible, not fully understood, but present. Held in fragments. In evidence that points but does not conclude. In memories that persist even as details fade. In the quiet acknowledgement that something happened here that was never fully brought into the light. And maybe that is the final weight of it. Not just that the story remains incomplete, but that it reminds us how often that is the case. How many truths exist in that space between what is known and what can be proven? How many stories end without the clarity we expect? The road outside Adelaide still stretches into the dark the same way it always has. The wind still moves through the scrub, carrying nothing and everything at once. And if you stand there long enough, you might feel it again, that subtle shift in the air, that sense that something once happened here that the landscape itself refuses to explain. It doesn't offer answers. It doesn't resolve anything. It simply holds the silence. And in that silence, the story remains. If there is a final shape to a case like this, it is not a conclusion. It is an absence that refuses to settle. Years after the last courtroom statement, after the last appeal, after the last renewed wave of public attention, the story of the family murders in South Australia still exists in that unsettled space between what is known and what was never fully reached. What remains is not silence in the sense of closure, but silence as continuation. A silence filled with unresolved trajectories, with paths that stopped abruptly, with questions that never found their final form. The names of the victims, once spoken in panic, then in investigation, then in courtrooms, now exist in a different register. They are no longer part of active pursuit, but they have not been allowed to fade either. They persist in memory, in documentation, in the quiet persistence of unfinished understanding. In cases like this, time does something unusual. It does not erase. It stratifies. Each passing year adds another layer of interpretation, another attempt at clarity, another revision of what might have happened. And yet the core does not change. The core remains resistant. Even the conviction of Bevan Spencer von Einem, which once stood as a moment of legal resolution, has not fully anchored the narrative. It defines a boundary within the case, a point of established responsibility for one element, but it does not absorb the entirety of what the case came to represent. Around that conviction, questions continue to orbit. Questions about scale, about coordination, about whether what was proven in court was the full extent of what occurred, or only a fragment made visible through the limitations of evidence. This is where true complexity begins to separate itself from conclusion. Because not every investigation ends in clarity. Some end in containment, a narrowing of focus that allows the legal system to function, even when the broader structure remains partially unseen. That containment is necessary for justice in a procedural sense, but it does not always satisfy the deeper human need for understanding. And so the story remains open in a different way. Not legally, but cognitively. In the minds of those who still examine it, still revisit it, still try to map its edges. Over time, the case has become less about a single sequence of events and more about what it reveals regarding systems of perception. How societies respond to patterns that emerge slowly. How institutions differentiate between isolated incidents and connected phenomena. How easily fragmentation can delay recognition. The most unsettling aspect is not only what happened, but how long it took for certain possibilities to be seriously considered. The idea that multiple events could be linked, that behavior could be structured, that individuals could operate within overlapping networks of access and opportunity. These are not conclusions the system arrived at quickly. They were built gradually, under pressure, through repetition and accumulation. And even now, they remain partially provisional. What endures most clearly is not the resolution of the case, but the echo of its investigative process. The way information accumulated without immediate synthesis. The way suspicion moved faster than confirmation. The way fragments of truth appeared before a framework existed to hold them together. For those who continue to study the case, it has become less about identifying a final answer and more about understanding how such answers are formed or fail to form. It exists now as a study in gaps. In what was visible versus what was accessible. In how narratives solidify under constraint. There is also the quieter impact, the one that does not appear in official summaries. It lives in the families who had to learn to speak about their sons not only as individuals but as part of a broader, unresolved story. It lives in the investigators who carried the weight of evidence that suggested more than it could prove. It lives in the journalists, researchers, and observers who encountered the case and found themselves unable to fully detach from its incomplete structure. Because some cases do not resolve into a single lesson. They expand outward. They reshape how uncertainty itself is understood. And perhaps that is where the final reflection rests. Not in who was definitively responsible for every element. Not in how every question was answered. But in the recognition that truth, in its most complex form, does not always arrive as completion. Sometimes it arrives as accumulation. Layer upon layer of partial clarity, each one revealing just enough to show how much remains beyond reach. The landscape outside Adelaide has not changed in any way that would mark it as significant. The roads still extend outward. The The scrub still moves with the wind. The distance still feels like distance. But for those who know the story, or even parts of it, that landscape carries an additional weight. Not visible, not measurable, but present in the way memory attaches itself to place. It does not speak. It does not explain. It simply remains. And in that remaining, the story continues not as an open case file, not as a concluded chapter, but as something quieter and more persistent. A reminder that some truths are not resolved by time. They are only carried by it. If there is a final layer to this story, it is not made of evidence or verdicts, but of what lingers after both have stopped being enough. In the years that followed the legal outcome surrounding the family murders in South Australia, the case did not disappear. It settled into a quieter form of existence, one that no longer demanded headlines every day, but also refused to become fully dormant. What remains is a kind of suspended understanding. The conviction of Bevan Spencer von Einem stands as a fixed point in the narrative, a legal conclusion that defines responsibility within the boundaries of what was proven in court. But outside those boundaries, the story continues to resist simplification. It expands into questions that were raised but never fully answered, patterns that were observed but never completely reconstructed, connections that were suspected but never definitively mapped. Time, instead of closing those gaps, has made them more visible in a different way. Not through new revelations, but through the slow accumulation of perspective. Each generation that revisits the case does so with different assumptions, different tools, different expectations of how truth should present itself. And yet, they arrive at the same place, a structure that feels incomplete, not because nothing is known, but because what is known does not fully contain what was experienced. The victims of the case remain at the center of this unresolved space. Their lives, once defined by ordinary trajectories, school, work, friendships, small ambitions, were interrupted in ways that reshaped how they are remembered. Over time, they have become part of a broader narrative, but that broader narrative has never fully succeeded in replacing who they were as individuals. The tension between those two forms of memory, personal and collective, remains unresolved. For the families, this tension is permanent. There is no point at which the passage of time transforms uncertainty into peace. Instead, there is adaptation. A gradual learning to live alongside questions that do not resolve, to carry versions of events that remain partially imagined because the full account was never available. The absence is not static, it evolves, shaped by what is learned, what is forgotten, and what is still being searched for. Within investigative circles, the case continues to exist as a reference point. Not as an active pursuit, but as a reminder of the limits of reconstruction. It demonstrates how evidence, even when substantial, can still leave large areas unlit. How narratives, even when legally established, can still leave conceptual space around them. How certainty in one domain does not necessarily translate into completeness in another. The broader public memory of the case has followed a similar pattern. Interest rises and falls in cycles, often triggered by anniversaries, documentaries, or renewed discussion in media spaces. Each resurgence brings with it a temporary intensification of attention, a re-examination of known facts, and sometimes the introduction of new interpretations. But these cycles rarely alter the core structure of understanding. They refine its edges, but they do not fill its center. What persists across all of this is the sense that the case is not finished in the way most cases are expected to be. It does not offer a clean separation between past and present. Instead, it occupies a continuous middle space, where conclusions exist alongside uncertainty, and where resolution is partial by necessity rather than by choice. In that space, the question of responsibility becomes both clearer and more complicated at the same time. Legally, responsibility was assigned within defined parameters. But conceptually, the case continues to suggest a wider field of possibility, one that includes questions about how actions were coordinated, how access was obtained, how patterns were sustained without earlier interruption. These are not questions that can be fully answered within the existing record. They belong to the margins of the case, to the areas where documentation thins and interpretation begins. And it is within those margins that the case continues to live. Not as an active investigation. not as a closed chapter, but as something that exists in between. There is a particular weight to cases that occupy this in-between state. They resist finality not because they lack structure, but because their structure is incomplete in ways that matter. They challenge the assumption that all significant events can be fully reconstructed after the fact. They suggest that some aspects of reality remain partially inaccessible, even when much of the surface has been examined. The roadways, landscapes, and quiet outskirts associated with the events remain physically unchanged. But their meaning, for those who know the history, is permanently altered. They are no longer neutral spaces. They are sites of inference, memory, and unresolved narrative. Places where what happened is not visible, but still present in the way it is remembered. And so the story continues, not because it is still unfolding in action, but because it continues to unfold in interpretation. Each attempt to revisit it adds another layer of understanding, but also another layer of distance from any final certainty. In the end, what remains is not a conclusion, but a condition. A recognition that some stories do not resolve into closure. They resolve into awareness. Awareness that truth can exist in fragments. That justice can exist within limits. That memory can persist even when explanation does not fully arrive. And within that awareness, the case continues to hold its place. Quiet. Persistent. Unfinished, not because it has been ignored, but because it has been seen as far as it can currently be seen. And perhaps that is the final truth it leaves behind. There are cases that end, and there are cases that simply stop changing. The story of the family murders in South Australia belongs firmly to the second category. It no longer evolves in the way active investigations do, yet it never settles into silence either. It remains suspended in a state where every return to it reveals not new answers, but new ways of understanding how much still cannot be fully known. The conviction of Bevan Spencer von Einem stands as the most defined point within that structure. It is the anchor around which the rest of the narrative has been forced to organize itself. But even anchors do not complete a map. They only fix one point, leaving the surrounding space open to interpretation, debate, and unresolved implication. What time has done to this case is not erase it, but redistribute it. The urgency that once surrounded it in newspapers, police briefings, and courtroom proceedings has faded from immediate attention, but it has not disappeared. It has shifted into archives, into documentaries, into academic discussion, into private conversations that surface unexpectedly when similar patterns are recognized elsewhere. And always, beneath those layers of reflection, the same structure remains: multiple deaths, similar in certain critical aspects, occurring within a defined period, in a defined region, under circumstances that never fully aligned with simple explanations. Each individual case can be described. Each has documentation, forensic interpretation, and legal classification. But when placed together, they generate a larger shape that has never been fully resolved. That larger shape is what continues to unsettle those who study it. Not because it lacks information, but because it exceeds the capacity of the information that exists. In the decades since the events, investigative techniques have advanced significantly. New forensic methods, improved data analysis, and broader understandings of behavioral patterns have all provided tools that were not available at the time. Yet even with these advancements, revisiting the case has not produced the kind of definitive closure that might be expected. Instead, it has reinforced something more uncomfortable: that some gaps are not the result of missing technology alone. They are the result of absence at the moment it mattered most. Moments not recorded. Interactions not witnessed. Decisions not fully captured in any recoverable form. For the families, this reality does not soften with time. It simply becomes part of how memory is carried. The lives of their sons are no longer only personal histories, they are also part of a public case file that continues to be referenced in broader discussions about criminal investigation, systemic oversight, and the limits of reconstruction. This dual existence creates a tension that never fully resolves. The private memory of who these individuals were exists alongside the public narrative of what happened to them. Neither replaces the other. Both remain necessary, and both remain incomplete on their own. Within professional circles, the case is often used as an example of how complexity can outpace structure. It illustrates how multiple incidents can initially appear disconnected, how early interpretations can solidify too quickly, and how difficult it can be to later reassemble a fragmented timeline into a coherent whole. It is studied not only for what it contains, but for what it reveals about investigative limitation. And yet, despite all analysis, the central uncertainty persists. Were all elements of the case fully contained within what was ultimately proven? Or does the established legal outcome represent only a portion of a wider reality that was never fully brought into view? These are questions that remain open not because they are ignored, but because they cannot be definitively resolved with the available record. In that sense, the case has become something larger than its original scope. It is no longer only about specific individuals or specific events. It has become a reference point for understanding how narratives are constructed under constraint, how systems respond to complexity, and how truth can exist in layers that do not always align neatly. Even the physical locations associated with the events carry this layered meaning. Ordinary spaces that once functioned without significance now exist within a dual context. They are still everyday environments for those who live there, but for those familiar with the history, they also represent points of intersection between normalcy and rupture. The landscape itself has not changed, but its interpretation has. And that is often how unresolved cases persist, not through active presence, but through altered perception. The final reflection that remains is not a resolution, but an acknowledgement of limits. Limits in evidence. Limits in reconstruction. Limits in how fully a sequence of human actions can be recovered once time, absence, and fragmentation have taken hold. The story does not conclude in a traditional sense because it was never fully available in a single form. It exists instead as a convergence of partial truths, each supported by documentation, each constrained by absence. And within that convergence, the case continues to live. Not as an open investigation. Not as a closed chapter. But as a reminder that understanding is sometimes asymptotic, approached, refined, clarified yet never entirely reached. And so, what remains is not an ending, but a recognition that some stories do not finish. They only continue to be understood, again and again, in slightly different ways, without ever fully arriving at completion.